Okay. So one of the first things I want to talk about with logic is this distinction that Lavin draws between rhetoric and reason. And, you know, look, I'm told some of my students have problems with this because I guess in some English classes they will use the word rhetoric to pick out something slightly different. And, if you have had a class where they use rhetoric in a different way, don't get hung up on that. What we're trying to get at here is this idea that there are reasons to believe something or do something, and there are other ways to persuade people to do it. And let me give you an example, right? I live in a neighborhood where we are just constantly plagued by solar panel salesmen, right? And people who want to be our new exterminator. And, these guys will ring on the doorbell, give you their whole spiel about solar panels, try to get you to buy solar panels, right? And some of the things they do, they'll give you what are pretty good reasons to buy a solar panel, right? Or put solar panels on your house. They'll say, well, look, solar panels cost X dollars, but you will save Y dollars on your power bill over the next 10 years. Y is bigger than X, so you'll save money if you get solar panels, right? Or, you know, solar panels will increase the value of your house by Z amount. They cost X, Z is bigger than X, right? Or add Y and Z together and, you get a whole bunch of money in the long run for having solar panels, right? If you care about money, and most of us do, that's a good reason to put solar panels on your house. I mean, I haven't done it yet. These guys just annoy me. Um, Back when we had our toddlers a little, they'd always knock right after the babies went to sleep, and I wanted to kill them. But anyway, but notice what else a salesman might do. They might say, come up to your house. Oh, look at your lovely home, right? Or if they saw my kids, they might be, you have such beautiful toddlers, right? Or they might flatter me, you're a smart man, and a smart man would want solar panels on his house, right? None of that is a reason to buy solar panels, right? The guy is flattering me. He's hoping that I'll do what he wants because he's flattering me. He might even be saying something true. I mean, my kids, I think, are very cute, right? But the fact that this dude recognizes the cuteness of my children is not a reason to put solar panels on my house, right? That is non-rational persuasion. Somebody trying to get you to do or what they want or believe what they want you to believe and not using rational means. And notice, if you tried to explain, why you did something, if you say, well, I put solar panels on my house because I thought it would save me all this money over time, and that money is more than the cost of solar panels. Remember, all right, I'll make sure you're right about it, but that's a pretty good reason to put solar panels on your house. Whereas if somebody told you, it's like, well, the salesman was really nice. He talked about how smart I was, how cute my kids were. But that's none of that's a reason to put solar panels on your house. This person's trying to manipulate you into doing what they want, but they're not giving you a good reason to do it. Now, we're going to talk about rhetoric, and by rhetoric, there's all kinds of forms of non-rational persuasion, right? You know, Maybe they will send somebody who's tall and good looking to sell solar panels, and he will dress up, or I don't know. That's also non-rational persuasion. We are more interested in written or spoken forms of non-rational persuasion. You know, that's what Lavin means by rhetoric. In logic, we are interested in whether somebody has given us a good reason to believe something or do something. And if they're using non-rational persuasion, rhetoric, they haven't. And so let me give you guys an example of rhetoric. Let me share my screen with you. This is a really good example of rhetoric, I think. I mean, not good in that I think the article's badly written and I don't buy what she says, but you know, fine example of rhetoric and underhanded persuasion. Now, one thing I want you guys to get in the habit of, the first thing you should always do when analyzing any argument is to find the conclusion. And in a well-written piece of writing that makes an argument, remember, not every piece of writing makes an argument. If someone's telling you about their vacation, somebody might talk about a really nice trip they had. They might write about that. They're not making an argument. Don't look for a conclusion, right? But if someone is trying to convince you of something, if they are making an argument, always look for the conclusion first. Now, in a well-written piece, it will usually be stated at the beginning and then in some form toward the end. Not everything is well written. And this article by Anne Applebaum is not well written. Um, Applebaum takes forever to tell you her conclusion, but in one version of the article, they do put the conclusion right here in the title. Mob justice is trampling democratic discourse. You know, I think that's the best version of this. Applebaum is trying to say, well, there's mob justice, these online mobs, these get in the way of democratic discourse, right? If you had to tease the conclusion out, you might have to be more careful. You know, you want to be precise, you want to be charitable, you want to be sensible when you pull a conclusion out. You know, you wouldn't want to attribute something to her like cancel culture is a problem. She might believe that, but what she's saying is more specific. And luckily, at least in one version of this, they give the conclusion right there in the title because she's not great about mentioning it. Mob justice is trampling democratic discourse. All right, that's her conclusion. Let's look at the writing here and see what she says. So, start with this picture here of somebody in stocks in front of, a jeering crowd. That's not rhetoric, but that's non-rational persuasion, right? Oh my gosh, look at these horrible, savage people who are putting someone in stocks. These people in the early modern medieval times who were just mean and cruel and unenlightened, right? Non-rational persuasion. Not rhetoric, because rhetoric is words, but, let's look at the words. It was no great distance in those days from the prison door to the marketplace. Measured by the prisoner's experience, however, it might be reckoned a journey of some length. So begins the tale of Hester Prynne as recounted in Nathaniel Hawthorne's most famous novel, The Scarlet Letter. As readers of this classic American text know, the story begins after Hester gives birth to a child out of wedlock and refuses to name the father. As a result, she is sentenced to be mocked by a jeering crowd, undergoing an agony from every footstep of all those that throng to see her, as if her heart had been flung into the street for them all to spurn and trample on. After that, she must wear a scarlet A for adulterer pinned to her dress for the rest of her life. On the outskirts of Boston, she lives in exile. No one will socialize with her, not even those that have quietly committed similar sins. Among them, the father of her child, the saintly village preacher. The Scarlet Letter has the effect of a spell, taking her out of ordinary relations with humanity and enclosing her in a sphere by herself. We read that story with a certain self-satisfaction, such an old-fashioned tale. Even Hawthorne sneered at the Puritans with their, quote, sad-colored garments and gray steeple-crowned hats, their strict conformism, their narrow minds, and their hypocrisy. And today we are not just hip and modern. We live in a land governed by the rule of law. We have procedures designed to prevent the meting out of unfair punishment. Scarlet letters are a thing of the past, except, of course, they aren't. Right here in America, right now, it is possible to meet people who have lost everything, jobs, money, friends, colleagues, after violating no laws, and sometimes no workplace rules either. Instead, they have broken or accused of having broken social codes having to do with race, sex, personal behavior, or even acceptable humor, which may not have even existed 5 years ago or maybe 5 months ago. Some have made egregious errors in judgment, some have done nothing at all. It is not always easy to tell. Well, now, think of the conclusion, which doesn't list here in these 4 paragraphs, which I said, at least in one version is helpfully put in the title, right? One of those things with it's annoying with online articles, they change the title like 8 times. But one time the leadoff was mob justice is trampling democratic discourse. If we are going to state that, we might put it in less emotional terms. Mob justice is interfering with democratic discourse or making it impossible or censoring it. But we can just go with this version, right? Now, I want you guys to notice, if we keep that in mind, her conclusion, there is a problem with mob justice trampling democratic discourse or interfering with it. Does anything she says in these first few paragraphs give us any reason to think that there's a contemporary problem with mob justice interfering with democratic discourse? Does recounting the Scarlet Letter? No. Does making fun of the Puritans? No. No, right? All these paragraphs, none of it gives us a reason to think that she's right. What is she doing here? She is painting an image from this book, The Scarlet Letter, which she thinks we might have read. I can't remember if we were supposed to read it in high school or not. If we were, I didn't read it, right? But I have the basic outline in mind. She's painting this picture of this novel of this woman who is treated horribly unfairly. And then she thinks, we're supposed to think, well, we don't want to be on the side of these people who treat this poor woman, these hypocrites who treat her unfairly. We want to be on the right side and Applebaum's side, right? Then she's playing on these prejudices we have about the Puritans. They're hypocrites, they're conformists, they don't dress very well. That's the weirdest criticism, right? You know, but again, even if the Puritans were sad conformists who wear ugly clothes, does that give us any reason to think that there's a modern problem with censorship, with people, online mobs punishing people for what they say? No, right? It could be true that the Puritans were terrible and they dressed horribly, looked silly. All that could be true, and it would do nothing to show that there is this problem that Applebaum describes, right? Now, I actually think she's being horribly unfair to the Puritans. I think the Puritans have a lot to recommend them. I don't think they were perfect, but if you look at the period, they were generally more tolerant. Most of the early abolitionists were Puritans. I think the Puritans get a bad rap. They weren't perfect. They deserve some criticism, but the sort of sneering stereotype Applebaum has, I think is just wrong and quite frankly kind of stupid. I know I tell you guys you should be charitable, you should try to be charitable, but also honesty is important too, right? But notice nothing hinges on this. If I'm right and Applebaum is horribly unfair to the Puritans and she's playing on these nasty stereotypes, that is not important to deciding whether she's right that there's a problem of modern censorship. If she's right about the Puritans being these horrible, stupid looking people, that again tells us nothing about whether there's this problem of censorship. Applebaum is painting an ugly picture for us of these people we might have some sort of cultural stereotype against, and she's hoping we will take her side because we don't want to be lumped with these people. None of this has anything to do with whether there is a contemporary problem of censorship. She paints a picture that we don't like, and we don't want to be part of that picture. We don't want to be part of this crowd up here, right? So we're going to go, we don't want to be on Team Puritan or Team Conformist or Team Stupid Clothes. So we're going to be on Ann Applebaum's team, self-described Team Free Speech, right? None of that gives us a reason to think there is this problem with censorship. There might be, there might not be. I tend to think that there's some problem with censorship. I don't think it's as bad as Applebaum does. She might be right. I might be right. We might both be wrong. There might be no problem. The problem it might be even worse than she says. The point is, she has given us no reason so far to accept her conclusion. In fact, you don't hit a reason to accept Applebaum's conclusion until one, two, three, four cases in, right? The first thing she says that might give you some reason to accept her claim, right here in America, right now, it is possible to meet people who have lost everything jobs, money, friends, colleagues after violating no laws and no workplace rules, sometimes no workplace rules either. Instead, they are accused of have broken or accused of breaking social codes having to do with race, sex, personal behavior, acceptable humor. If that is true, that would give you some reason to think there is this problem with online mobs getting in the way of democratic discourse, right? Might not be a great reason. I think we'd want more reason than that. We'd also want to know whether this claim is true. Who are these people? What did they say? But this at least gives us some small reason to think that there is this problem if it is true. But you have to read 4 paragraphs into this before you get any good reason to think that Anne Applebaum's main claim is right, right? And what we want to do in logic is we don't want people to manipulate us. We don't want to be taken in. We don't want to fall for rhetoric or non-rational persuasion. If I ask you guys to evaluate this argument, whether distilling it, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, or diagramming it, the first thing I would want you to do is just to strike. If you had this on paper, put a big X through. If you had it on a Word file, delete the first 4 paragraphs because there is nothing here that gives us a reason to think that Applebaum is right, that mob justice is trampling democratic discourse. This is on the same, believing that what she says is true because of all this stuff about the Puritans and their ugly hats or the Scarlet Letter. That's like buying a solar panel because the guy says your kids are cute, right? You shouldn't do it. You're being manipulated. That's what people do when they use rhetoric, right? Now, maybe Applebaum has some good reasons for what she says. I'm not going to lie, I'm not convinced by this article, and I do think it's very badly written. But, maybe we can go through and find some reasons if we read further. So far, she has given us none. And, later in the article, she actually tops herself. She compares the people who disagree with her to Stalin, the brutal, murderous Russian dictator. Yeah, I mean, I think the Puritans get a bad rap. Even I'm not going to defend Stalin. But, right, I can agree that Stalin is a horrible person without thinking that there's this problem that Applebaum describes. So when you see rhetoric like this, learn to spot it, learn to ignore it, right? And sometimes people will use rhetoric in written works just to make things prettier, right? Little scene setting, a little decoration. Think about a building, right? Nobody would want to live in ugly concrete buildings, even if they were pretty well built and structurally not going to fall over, right? Putting some paint, putting a nice roof, putting some shutters on it, that's not a problem. When there starts to be a problem, though, is if you have a shoddy building, a badly built building, and you try to make it pretty to cover up all the structural problems, right? Well, and a metaphor I like for arguments is, your premises, all the reasons you're giving are like the building, the structure that's supposed to support the way to the conclusion. Well, when people have a shoddy building, a lot of times they'll pretty it up with a lot of rhetoric, so you won't notice that the whole thing is about to fall over, right? In the same way, if you were looking at a house, you know, if the place had structural problems, you shouldn't be taken in by the fact the bathroom's pretty or the coat of paint on the outside's pretty. If an argument is a bad one, if the structure's bad, don't be distracted by the rhetoric. Learn to look at the structure itself. So, not every use of rhetoric is underhanded. Sometimes people just want to make their argument more pretty, more interesting, but sometimes they will use rhetoric to cover up serious problems, which is honestly what I think Applebaum does in this article. I'm not going to keep beating up on it, but just learn to spot that.